There's this conception in filmmaking that for something to be cinematic, we have to have the most insanely shallow depth of field, we have to have the camera on a gimbal or like rotating it all over the place, and we have to be playing with frame rates. And that could not be further from the truth. If you want to make cinematic shots, it's actually quite simple. All right, people, I am Garrett, and cinematography, the art of camera work, is one of the main differences between movies as a storytelling medium versus every other type of storytelling there is. And the reason is because, of course, like if we look at stage plays still have actors, they have lights, they have music, they have all of the things that we use in movies except the camera. And the camera in filmmaking is such a powerful storytelling tool. In cinematography, kind of the first main rule that you learn is that you need to know and adhere to the rules. The second rule of cinematography is to break those rules with intent. So for every one of the rules that we're going to talk about today, you could show me an example of a great film or short that breaks the rule that I'm talking about, and you'd be right. But we have to know the rules before we can break the rules. Now, we obviously are not looking at all of the rules of cinematography today, but we are going to look at 5 of the easiest or simplest ways that you can enhance the cinematic language of the stories that you're telling with the camera. So, without further ado, here's number 1. The first is depth of frame. Now, depth of frame is very different from depth of field. Depth of field refers to the amount of our image that is in acceptable focus, where depth of frame refers to building a world that seems to exist in 3 dimensions. Now, I'm not talking about shooting in 3D. All of the screens that we watch content on inherently are flat, meaning that we're only seeing things in 2 dimensions, our x-axis and our y-axis. The z-axis, the you to me going this way, that's all made up. Because of course, we're not projecting into 3D space, we're seeing things on a flat surface. Because we're looking at an image on a flat surface, building depth within our frame becomes increasingly important to make the world feel like it exists in the way that the real world does in 3 dimensions. A way we can build depth within our frame is by utilizing depth cues, or taking things that we understand the relative size of, like people, or like a plant or a cell phone, and by strategically placing our camera and props and set design in our space to where we're shooting through things, to where there would be a foreground element, our focal point or our midground element, and then a background element. Those 3 layers that we're shooting through are going to give us that perception that there is depth, that there is stuff that is close to us, a little further and much further from us. Now, this may sound simple, and it is, but we need to think about that for every single one of our shots, building that depth within our frame for the entirety of the story that we're telling. If our images look flat, our audience will instantly attribute that to being boring. Whereas if our shots have depth, our audience will feel much more immersed. So for every shot, in every frame of the stories that we're telling, we need to keep in mind building on these axes, right? It's not just the X and the Y axes, but it's building along the Z axis, because that's what's going to literally pull our audience into the world that we're building. We can do an entire video just on lens theory, and if that's something that you'd be interested in seeing, comment down below and let me know. But the basics of lenses, like cameras, really help tell our story in a cinematic way. It's not just about zooming in or zooming out to get kind of the mid-ground framing that we're looking for. Each type of lens can directly contribute to the type of story that we're trying to tell. Lenses get broken down into kind of 3 buckets. We have wide lenses, normal lenses and long lenses, or telephoto lenses. Each lens type changes the relationship between the subject and the environment that we're in. That's a concept called perspective distortion. And while we're not going to get into all of what perspective distortion means in this video, the general rule of thumb is the wider lens you use, the further everything is going to be pulled apart, seemingly. So again, thinking about things in terms of our depth of frame, we have a foreground, a midground, and a background. A wide angle lens is going to separate all of those planes. A normal lens is going to feel very much like our regular vision, right? The way that we perceive distance between things. And our long lenses are going to compress that, where it's going to make everything feel like it's much, much closer together. In the narrative of the films and the stories that we're telling, what is our subject doing in relationship to the world around them? And what lenses could we then use to help tell that story? It's not just about setting the camera down, putting your person in a place, and then putting on a lens that gets them in the frame the way that you want them. Move the camera, get closer to them, get further away from them, and then use the lens that makes the most sense for the type of story that you're trying to tell, or for what is happening in that moment. That is a way that your audience is never even going to notice what you've done, but they're going to resonate and feel it on a very, very deep level, building on the performances of your actors. Again, making better, more cinematic stories. Next, we have the rule of thirds. This is one of the first things that you would learn in film school, something that you've probably heard of and you might even be very familiar with. That rule in its simplest form is you divide the screen into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, and you kind of create this 9 grid. Where those lines meet, those points are the most appealing points in our frame that we can place our subjects. When we create a composition, when we create our framing, putting things off center and putting things in places that make a little bit more sense, whether, I have my subject facing this direction and they're sitting here having a conversation off camera, having it center frame is one thing, but if I push in a little bit and I move it onto the third, now I have a shot that makes more sense. Part of that rule of thirds, though, that kind of it piggybacks onto that, is the idea of lead room. Lead room is the concept when somebody is looking into the frame, right? Again, going back to this shot, if I'm looking into the frame, we want to give me as much breathing room on this side as we can. If we cram me into the side of the frame and give me breathing room on this side, now all of a sudden it feels claustrophobic and incorrect. So knowing which point in my frame my subject should be enhances the rule of thirds to now not only look appealing from a compositional framing perspective, but feel appealing narratively or emotionally in my subject's performance. This is one of the many reasons why storyboarding is so important, because in storyboarding, we can draw out our rule of thirds, right? That 9 grid. And then in building our compositions and our frames, when we get on set, we know how to block and position people, and we know where to put our camera to then achieve the final look because we have a reference image that we're working with. A really important thing to remember when setting up shots and filming a movie is that the camera is literally the only eyeballs our audience has. It's the only thing that our audience is going to see. Anything that the camera doesn't catch, the audience won't see. And so we need to think about the camera in terms of the audience and in terms of a character and how we want that audience to feel. And changing the height of our camera and the vertical perspective of our camera with the relationship to the environment that it's in is another subtle way that we can build on that narrative story. And it doesn't have to be super dramatic, right? We don't always have to drop the camera super low and shoot really, really high angles. And we don't have to bring the camera super high and shoot down at really low angles. You could do it really, really subtly by as little as 5, maybe 10 degrees off of what eye level would be. And what that does is it creates a power dynamic between the audience and the person that they're looking at. If we make the audience small and we have them looking up at something, we've instantly changed the power dynamic to the thing that they're looking at or the person that they're looking at as having more power than them. Whereas if we bring the camera up in relationship to our subject, and now we're looking down on them, now we have given the audience or the camera much more power. And again, not a whole lot. You don't have to go crazy with it, but just little subtle ways like that go a long way in making an emotional argument to your audience for how they're supposed to feel, again, without them even really knowing it. The last thing I want to talk about are focal points, and focal points are exactly what they sound like. They are the thing that our audience's eyes are drawn to. And it's important that in every shot, we have a focal point. Not just a starting point and an ending point, but throughout the shot, we need the audience to be able to comprehend and track with the thing that we want them to be looking at. And we do that by using and utilizing the other things that we've talked about, right? We need to build depth within our frame. We need to have a foreground, a midground, and a background. And we need that because our audience is then going to separate what's happening in the frame and know the thing that's important. We need to utilize the correct lenses for the type of story that we're telling in that moment, because that's either going to expand or compress the world around our subjects. We use the rule of thirds to create appealing and easing compositions in frames so our audience isn't confused as to what they're looking at. At the end of the day, if our audience can't see what we're trying to show them, right, or they can't focus on the things we're wanting them to see, we've lost, right? That's not a cinematic composition. I can't tell you how many times I've seen like epic B-roll as a thing, and all it is just a bunch of camera movements. Camera movements aren't what make things cinematic. What makes things cinematic is using the camera to elevate the story that we're telling. You can have pretty images without having a story, but that's not cinematic. That's just moving photography. In filmmaking, it's always about balance. If we do our jobs properly, everything becomes invisible, right? Film nerds like you and I can watch a film and go, wow, that's really cinematic, or wow, that looks really cinematic, or wow, that's really cinematic, right? Because that word gets thrown around all the time. But for the great majority of people who watch our work, they don't see the same things we see. They don't look at films the same way we look at them. And at the end of the day, we want our work to be invisible, because if it's invisible, that means that they are fully sucked into the world that we have built. And they're no longer watching a movie, but they're experiencing it. And that is the ultimate way to get cinematic shots. I want to make sure that I'm making stuff that you want to see. So if there is a topic that you want to cover, if there is a question that you have, comment it down below, because I want to make sure that the stuff I'm creating is stuff that helps our community. I hope you found this helpful, and if you did, do me two favors. Give it a like. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe for more. And as always, I'll see you in the next episode.